Right. So today we're going to talk about supply and demand. Now, in the background, there's a chart of supply and demand. Um, you know, it's amazing how many times I run across owner operators who don't understand supply and demand. It's something as a small business owner you really need to get a handle on. Watch this video, read some articles, do your own research, watch some more YouTube videos on supply and demand. The thing about it is that pricing controls a lot of decision making. Whether you purchase a certain type of truck, a type of make, model, year, mileage, all depends on the price. The price is the determining factor, and so you need to understand how supply and demand works. Hear the old saying, "A dime a dozen." Think of something that's fairly inexpensive. Let's just say, for example, an office worker, who answers the telephone and schedules appointments, like a receptionist. You can imagine that there would be millions of people that would want that job. So that job is a very low paying job. Now let's take for example, a doctor. Doctor is highly trained, highly skilled, very stressful type of job, and they there's not as many people who are willing or able to have that type of skill to be a physician. So the supply of doctors towards the population may be somewhat restricted, so their earnings go up. So on one hand, you have a dime a dozen receptionists. On the other hand, you have a highly qualified, hard to fill position for a doctor. So what happens is that as things become more rare, they become more expensive. That's why you see antique cars when they go up for auction. It'll say this is off the production line of one of only 100 cars that were ever made. And the cars are selling for like $1 million each. In mint condition. It's because of the rarity. So the supply is limited, and the demand is high, and the price is high. Well, you could see the same thing with truck prices. The demand is strong, the supply may be limited, and so the truck prices are elevated. And where these two points of data meet is the market price. So where the supply meets demand, that's the market price. As the supply exceeds demand, then the price will come down. As demand exceeds supply, the prices go up. So that, like during the pandemic, truck prices were outrageous. They just went through the roof. Why was that? Well, it's because the demand for trucks was extremely high and the supply of good reliable trucks was low. So the prices went up. So after the pandemic, the demand came down and the prices came down. So we often think about what's going on in the economy. We think about the interest rates, we think about truck prices. This all comes back to supply and demand. Now, let's say, for example, the economy is growing. There's going to be more freight to haul. So there's going to be a much larger demand for good used equipment. Okay, so prices will naturally go up. During a recession, the economy slows down, freight comes down, prices come down. The demand came down and the supply stayed the same, so then prices come down. So this is a fundamental principle as owner operator you need to understand: supply and demand. This is like on the spot market. Why are rates so terrible currently in the year 2025? Well, it's supply and demand. There's far too many carriers on the spot market for the number of loads that are available. So they're fighting over scraps, and they're outbidding one another. They're race to the bottom. and this is a perfect example of supply and demand. There's too much supply of trucks, not enough loads or demand, so prices come down. Now, when the economy gets stronger, there become more loads available, and then you'll get higher rates. But then higher rates attract more carriers to enter the spot market, and the rates will come back down. So it's always shifting. Supply and demand is always shifting. You could think about a Christmas toy that's really, really hot. Years ago, there used to be a doll that was very popular at Christmas time. It's called the Cabbage Patch doll. People were going nuts trying to buy this doll, and you would see the lines, people waiting in line to purchase a doll, and then these became collectible items. Same thing when there's a new release of a popular video game. You'll see people waiting in line. Or how about when there's a popular concert? People want to get tickets to that concert. So they're waiting in line. They're camping 24 hours, or like the new iPhone release. They're camping in front of the store for 24 hours before it opens, so they can be first in line to buy the product. The demand is very, very high, and so the prices go high. So if once the popularity of that item goes away, then the prices come down. So eventually, the Cabbage Patch doll lost its appeal, and then the prices came back down. Same thing as the video game becomes older, it becomes outdated and the price comes down. And that's true with everything. With supply and demand. It's the latest greatest technology has a lot of demand, so it has a high price associated with it. But as supply improves, as the manufacturing improves, the supply chain catches up with demand, then the prices will start coming down. It's like when flat screen TVs first came out. It was like, this is amazing technology. And it was like, well, these TVs are very, very expensive. But what happened was more manufacturers started making flat screen TVs. So as the supply went up, the demand stayed the same, but the supply went up. More TVs available, so the price came down. This is generally how products go through a life cycle. They're introduced, a new product is introduced, it has a peak, and then it phases out. And the price is the highest when the demand is the highest and supply is limited. So as a small business owner, you really need to get a handle on how supply and demand works. It affects pricing of everything in the economy. A dime a dozen. That means it's plentiful and cheap. Rare is expensive. Something that's limited in supply is going to be expensive. You see this oftentimes in sales techniques too. It's like, hurry now and purchase before supplies run out. you know so they're trying to push those sales, because people understand how supply and demand works. So um, as an owner operator, you try to buy in bulk. It lowers the price. These things, like your supplies, whatever it is, you can try to control costs. That's why when you go to a big wholesale club and you buy in bulk, it's much cheaper. But supply and demand explains a lot. You want to understand how the economy works, understand how supply and demand works. If you look at drivers' wages, for example, why are drivers paid the way they are? Well, companies look at that driver as a unit of labor. Let's say, for example, uh, a unit of labor costs $10. Okay, they have plenty of people applying for that job, so they don't need to pay you more than $10. But if the pool of applicants goes down, then they'll have to start paying more for you to do that job because they couldn't easily replace you. This is part of the argument behind immigration is it keeps wages down. Well, why does it keep wages down? Well, it's because the supply of labor is high, and then that keeps wages down. So if you limit immigration, then the workers will have higher wages. But as long as companies can easily replace with cheaper labor, prices are going to stay low. So supply and demand controls everything in the economy. Everything in the economy. You saw egg prices. When the egg prices went up was because the supply of fresh eggs was low. Egg prices went up. So same thing with cost of barrel of oil. War in the Middle East restricts supply. Global price of oil goes up. As there's peace in the world and the price of the oil is more plentiful, prices come down. You see this at the fuel pump, at the gas pump. You see it in the grocery store. You see it in your wages. You see it the price of gold. As gold is more plentiful, and there's stability in the world, then price of gold comes down. When people are fearful and there's a high demand for gold, the price of gold goes up. So supply and demand explains a lot of how the world operates. You can imagine that as an owner operator, let's say you're on the spot market, okay? You got one truck, one trailer, all right? There's one load and 10 drivers are fighting for that load. Well, there's going to be a real low price on that load because there's too much supply, not enough demand. The demand is for one load. The load is the demand, okay? There's a supply of 10 truck drivers. Price is going to come down. Now, if there was 10 loads, but only one truck driver, the price of the load goes up. So this is how supply and demand works. We really need to get a handle on it. When you think about purchasing equipment or making a financial decision, oftentimes you'll think, is it better to wait? Should I wait for another 6 months, see if the economy slows down, interest rates come down? You're thinking that you're thinking along these terms of supply and demand, whether you realize it or not. You're thinking, okay, well, if the economy slows down, then trucks are going to become more affordable. It's going to become more affordable because there's going to be less demand, and the prices will come down. It's not anything else. Whether you realize it or not, you are thinking about supply and demand. Now, if you think that the economy is going to really improve, it's going to be really, really strong, and you don't want to wait because you think that truck prices are going to go higher, you're also thinking about supply and demand, because now you're like, well, the economy is going to get stronger, demand for trucks is going to go up, prices are going to go up. So whether you realize it or not, you were thinking about supply and demand and how that affects price. So this is a very fundamental principle of business that you need to get a handle on. It explains wages, it explains pricing, it explains a lot of things, how the world works. It's all about supply and demand. And if you don't understand it, you need to spend some time on it and get a handle on it. All right, guys, so I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.